bienvenue à tous les participants. Je suis content, là, je vois qu'il y a une trentaine de personnes, c'est agréable. Et puis dire que c'est la première d'une série de 4 conférences que nous avons organisées, Jean-François Gauvin, Yves Bergeron, Habib Saidi et moi-même, dans le cadre de notre projet qui est financé par le CRSH sur la gouvernance des musées. Et puis que la série va porter essentiellement sur la gouvernance, mais la gouvernance en situation de crise, hein, parce qu'on voulait s'assurer de répondre à une demande actuelle. Tout le monde sait que les musées sont pris là, avec une crise, la crise COVID, et puis surtout l'adaptation après la crise. Alors, voilà. Alors, donc, on a chacun un invité. C'est Jean-François qui a invité la première personne et donc c'est lui qui va la présenter. OK, Jean-François, merci. Hein?
Oui, il n'y a pas de souci. Merci à toi, Laurier. Donc, en effet, bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à cette conférence là, du Centre de recherche culture en société CELAT et aussi de l'Institut du patrimoine culturel IPAC, dont Laurier est le directeur. Donc, ce sont une série de conférences conjointes entre le CELAT et l'IPAC. Donc, mon nom est Jean-François Gauvin, je suis professeur au département des sciences historiques à l'Université Laval, directeur du programme de DESS en muséologie et aussi le directeur général du CELAT là, depuis un peu plus d'1 an. C'est pour moi un immense plaisir de prendre quelques minutes pour vous présenter Brenda Tindal, qui est la directrice exécutive du Harvard Museums of Science and Culture de l'Université Harvard. J'ai eu le privilège d'être aux premières loges de la création de cette entité en 2011, qui regroupe 6 musées de recherche de renommée internationale sous l'égide de la Faculté des arts et des sciences de l'Université Harvard. Il s'agit du Harvard University Herbaria, du Harvard Museum of Natural History, le Museum of Comparative Zoology, la Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments que j'ai dirigé justement quand j'étais à Harvard pendant quelques années, le Harvard Museum of Ancient Near East, qui a changé de nom, c'était le Semitic Museum avant, et le Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. Ensemble, ils forment un tout exceptionnel et une ressource sans égale pour la mission d'enseignement et de recherche de l'Université Harvard. Brenda Tindal, notre invitée, a été récemment nommée à la tête de cette organisation-là. Elle possède plus de 20 ans d'expérience, près de 20 ans d'expérience dans le domaine des musées, des universités et des bibliothèques, où elle s'attaque aux enjeux sociaux, historiques et éthiques de la gouvernance de ces institutions afin de cultiver des relations authentiques et durables avec les communautés locales, nationales et internationales. À travers une pratique muséale innovante, des programmes publics en tout genre, des partenariats stratégiques et un programme de recherche universitaire de premier ordre, Brenda Tindal est une leader dans le domaine de l'équité, de la diversité et de l'inclusion. Un domaine qui, selon elle, demande une bonne dose de courageous inquiry, des explorations ou des investigations courageuses. Brenda Tindal est récipiendaire de nombreuses accolades et d'honneurs, dont un fellowship de l'Institute of Museums and Library Services, l'IMLS des États-Unis, qui s'est déroulé à l'Université Princeton en 2011 et 2012, et le Museum Leadership Award for Innovation, Practice and Leadership within the Museum Field by the Southeastern Museum Association en 2020. Donc, ça me fait un très, très grand plaisir de l'accueillir. And now, without further ado, we'll switch to English. And this is a great pleasure that I invite you to listen to our guest talk entitled Beyond Cabinets of Curiosity, Museums as Centers of Courageous Inquiry. Thank you so very much, Ms. Tindal, for being with us today.
Wow, many thanks, Jean-François, for the gracious introduction and your generous invitation to participate in today's Center for Research of Culture, Arts, and Society Symposium. I am both honored and just delighted to be here with you all. My presentation, as you know, is entitled Beyond Cabinets of Curiosity, Museums as Sites of Courageous Inquiry in the 21st Century. And before I begin sort of my presentation in earnest, I thought I'd begin with a few questions and would love to hear from those in attendance. I believe that we can talk during this portion of the presentation, but also I welcome you depositing any questions that you may have or responses you may have in the chat feature. So let's start. My first question, which is really simple. What is the role of museums in society, right? Almost the sort of the $1 million quandary, if you will. And the second question is, what perceptions do people have about the cultural and inherently educational institutions for which museums constitute? So let's begin with that first question. In your opinion, what is the role of museums in society?
Vas-y, Émilie.
Yes, hi. I think the principal role of a museum in society is to educate people about principally our history, but museum can have different fields associated with it. But I think that's principally for education and to propagate what the researchers have found.
Thank you so much. And that was Emily?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Do I see other takers?
Tu peux y aller, Laurier.
Well, I would just add, I think they also have an important role to bring about critical thinking about society, to think critically about society and ask important questions and provoke debate.
Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. So I heard the sort of the inherently educational contours of museums, but also as catalysts for deliberation, for dialogue, for engaging critical issues. Any other takers with that particular question? And I'm not sure that I'm seeing everyone, but see, I do see 2 posts in the chat. Let's see. Educate, transmit heritage, and open people's mind. And first role is to relate the public to his past, to his material and immaterial culture. Those are great responses. Let's move to the second question. What perceptions do people have about museums, about these institutions? What perceptions do people have about these institutions? What perceptions do people have about these institutions?
If I can just quickly, I think that most people think that they are the caretakers of our past. So with all of the objects, what they have to preserve, to take care of those objects. And so museums are seen as the places where history has been done, and then so museums are there to preserve what people have produced over the past millennium. So.
So it's about preserving heritage. And I love the phrasing that you use, being caretakers of the past. I think I see 2 additional posts in the chat. They can be seen as conservative and static institutions, and they present reality and truth. First role is to relate the public to his past, to his material. Okay, that's an extension of that. Any others? If there are none, we actually have more in the chat. Let's see. For some people, museums are these big institutions of knowledge, often seen as conservative, static, etc. For other people, and more nowadays, I think they are places of learning. And I think what you all have indicated is the complexity of museums, the role that they play in society, the ways in which they are indeed these stewards of the past, and catalysts for conversation in the present. Also, in addition to that, in the chat, a response to that, I think the perception depends on social categories. Another response was that they can be seen as intimidating for people, I think. Oh, these are all excellent, and really a launch pad for what I want to talk about today, particularly as it relates to courageous inquiry and this idea of seeing museums beyond this idea of being cabinets of curiosity. So long before I chose to become a museum practitioner or had any sort of sophisticated understanding of a career in the museum field, I often saw museums through the public history or humanities lens, really as places that had the possibility of making important interventions in how I discovered and understood the past, how I embodied the present, and also how I imagined the future. And case in point, if you'll tolerate me for just a second, I'd like to share a story with you. When I was in the 10th grade, I remember taking a course. It was a cross-listed course, English and debate. And it was with the fabulous Barbara Miller. And if you know anything about debate, there are all of these different categories. There is Lincoln Douglas, there is, interpretive events. And I remember Miss Miller handing me a speech that had been written by a woman by the name of Isabel Bumphrey. Anyone know who Isabel Bumphrey is, by the way? Isabel Bumphrey. Anybody know who Sojourner Truth is? Most people are a bit more familiar with Sojourner Truth than Isabel Bumphrey, and they're the same individual. Sojourner Truth, who was a formerly itinerant, who was a formerly enslaved person turned itinerant preacher turned women's and civil rights advocate. In the 19th century, she had done something that really was unheard of, which was Black women being on the public stage, being in the public forum, and taking on human and civil rights issues. And in 1851, allegedly, she went to a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio, and she stood on the stage. And if you would, again, tolerate me for just a second, I'd like to share with you what she said. I'm going to do a bit of a transformation. So I am going to go from Brenda to Sojourner Truth. So in 1851, just imagine, maybe even close your eyes. Sojourner Truth mounts the stage, and she looks out before an audience of a largely all-white audience. And this is what she says. That man over there said that a woman needs to be helped in the carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere, you see. Nobody ever helped me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me a best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm, you see. Eyes plowed and planted and gathered into barns. And you know what? No man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man if I could get to it and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? That man in black there said that a woman can't have as much rights as a man because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with them. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone? Together, women ought to be able to turn it right side up again. And apparently, Sojourner Truth walked off the stage, clearly making a statement, clearly leveraging the question, ain't I a woman? I tell you, beyond this encounter, and I use the term encounter quite deliberately here, beyond this encounter with Truth's speech, with African-American history, with women's history, learning about the institution of slavery, I wondered, why is this the first time I'm learning about this brilliant and courageous woman? And two, are there libraries or museums that might supplement this new learning and deepen my understanding of this incredibly flawed world Truth navigated as a formerly enslaved woman turned itinerant preacher turned women's and civil rights activist? It was after sort of calling on museums to be a supplement that I understood the power and the general gravitational pull of museums as sites of alternate learning, as places where I could ask new and courageous questions. I've been engaged since then, and that was many moons ago, again, 10th grade. I won't tell you my age. A good Southern woman never would. But that's been many moons ago. But I've been engaged in the museum field for nearly 20 years. And based on my own research, observations, professional experiences, and being in dialogue with other museum practitioners and communities they serve, there seems to be 4 observations or assumptions that dominate how museums have figured into the national and global imagination. And some of what you've shared in responding to those questions figure quite neatly into that. But I'll start with this. One of the assumptions, one of the observations that I have come to hear in the dialogue is that people often conflate museums with art, right? And this is not about bastardizing art museums. I personally love art museums and find them to be in the vanguard of the field's most creative, provocative, and profoundly future-facing entities. But in this tendency to sort of conflate museums with art, there is a risk of developing this very myopic vision of museums and the roles they play in society. And this sort of parochial perception of museums as places for the display and discrete interpretation of art can sometimes work to marginalize the vastness, the multidisciplinary and diverse ways museums function in their communities, and indeed serve society writ large. In short, art museums are part of a large ecosystem of cultural institutions that include, but are not limited to, national and regional history, science centers, culturally specific institutions, children's museums, historical societies, zoos, aquariums, herbaria, botanical gardens, university museums, heritage sites, and other mixed media and multi-purpose galleries, archives, and research collections. How many of you, when you think about a museum, think about art museums, or have often sort of immediately art came to mind? And you can put your answers in the chat. Celia said, not me, never. I love history museums, not me. This has given me so much joy to know that at least in this circle, when we think about museums, it's not limited to art museums. Art museums are so beautiful. They are, Anne Laurie, they are. They absolutely are. And they're in constant communication with an interdisciplinary network of museums and cultural institutions. The other sort of very interesting assumption or observation that I've encountered and is at the center of my presentation today is that museums are seen as these cabinets of curiosity. And to be sure, when I talk about cabinets of curiosity, I talk about destinations that are understood as sites of looking, right? That these are destinations where the primary activities include marveling at art, or engaging with precious heirlooms, or interrogating obscure artifacts. And in these cabinets of curiosities, these are galleries. What we envision are these galleries lined with vitrines and cases filled with unique specimens. And of course, besides looking in awe, the visitor experience entails consuming exorbitant amounts of text, data, and scholarly interpretation. And while these are all exercises that I value so deeply as both a museum enthusiast and practitioner, I know that the impact and virtues of museums transcend these very, what I would call sort of voyeuristic proclivities. And so often when people think about museums or museums enter the national and global imagination, it is a site of looking. That often we're not always thinking about the dialectic, right? The new knowledge that the visitor brings to, for instance, the visitor or museum experience. What I've also heard and believe to be absolutely true is that museums are trusted institutions. And so it's not uncanny or unrealistic that as a 10th grader, I thought, well, the museums have the answer. Well, the museums can complicate or nuance my understanding of history. And if you look at the data, right, you look across aquariums, art museums, history museums, science centers, natural history museums, zoos, NGOs, you'll see that people generally have a real investment and trust in museums. And if you're familiar with Colleen Dessenscheider's Know Your Own Bone, she writes, people also trust museums. This level of trust is not to be taken lightly, and it's a testament to organizations that stand by their missions to educate and inspire audiences. It may also be argued that museums are trusted because they employ and or consult topic experts and thus provide credible content. And so indeed, everything that we were talking about at the very top of the conversation, right? Museums being sites of education, museums being places that inspire dialogue and engagement. This is all part of the reason why museums are trusted institutions. But the plot thickens, right? Yes, museums are trusted institutions, and it's one of the reasons why I chose to become a museum practitioner, right? It's because I know that there is mission critical work happening in museums. But what we also know, and I suspect this group is very fully aware of, is that museums also have a complex past and a complex present. And if you've seen the film Black Panther, you probably recall the moment when Killmonger, the gentleman here in the middle, is in the fictive British Museum, and he's looking at these objects on display. And it is a moment where the discourse turns from cabinet of curiosity to the realization that museums have been a part of the colonial complex, right? And as a result of that, because we know that museums have these very complex and complicated histories, museums are often the site of great debate, of contested conversation, and oftentimes have been ground zero for not only sort of interpretive conversations, but also real day-to-day pedestrian conversations about issues like descendant communities, about human remains, about inclusiveness and belonging within the context of the museum setting. It's often been called on to be far more courageous, to be more than a cabinet of curiosity, to be more than just trusted. Museums are actually being tasked with being courageous and being the facilitators and conveners of what I call courageous inquiry. And what I mean by courageous inquiry is that a willingness to take on topics, to ask questions of themselves, to democratize processes, to invite community who aren't necessarily experts, so to speak, or museum practitioners, but acknowledging that they bring a expertise as well, and that they can inform the visitor experience in some important ways. And I thought, as an example, I don't want to just sort of define what I mean by courageous inquiry. I'd like to demonstrate and provide a case study of how in my own work, I've not only sort of theorized around courageous inquiry, but I've also practiced it. And if you'll give me just a second, I'd like to switch from this slide to another deck, which has some images that I'd like to share. Some of you may know and may be very familiar with this. Give me just a second, I'm going to switch. Some of you may be quite familiar and versed in all of the issues that have been happening globally and certainly within the US context around the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance. And one of the things that has completely, I would say, shook at minimum a museum that I had worked with to its core were the onslaught of officer-involved shootings that were taking place throughout the US. And if you recall, the very hyper visibility, them being captured on camera and being on full display shocked our system. And it inspired me to curate a show that would not only test the mission and practice of the museum that I'd worked with on this project, but it really required the kind of courageous inquiry that I am talking about that is almost imperative that 21st century museums be equipped to address contemporary social and not necessarily political issues, but to be a place where community can come and convene, not just talk about the past, deal with the present, and be future facing and courageous in the ways in which they deal with contemporary issues and issues that are directly impacting their communities and the wider global community to which we all belong. I'm going to share my screen again. Let's try that again. Sorry about that. It's not allowing me to share. Can you see my screen now? Many apologies. Can you see my screen? And you see the no justice, no peace?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So in 2017, as many of you may be familiar with, in 2017, a number of high-profile officer-involved shootings took place throughout the US and in major cities. And one of those major cities included my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. At the time, I was the staff historian and senior vice president of research and collections at the Levine Museum of the New South. And in many ways, where the museum was located, it was right in the town center. The shooting of Keith Lamont Scott, a member of the Charlotte community, again, it occurred in September of 2016. But as you look at this sort of juxtaposition, America's conversation on race and violence continues. This was not just a local issue, it was absolutely a national one. But sometimes when the matter hits close to home, it shakes the discourse, it shakes the core of your existence in a different way. By this time, we had already heard about Michael Brown, we'd heard about Philando Castile, we'd heard about so many other men and women who were victims of police and civilian discord. But in Charlotte, many Charlotteans began to ask the question, how could this happen here? And from that, this sort of clarion call, this sort of roar of no justice, no peace, no justice, no peace emerged. Levine Museum of the New South, the community came to the museum and it really considered it to be a place where community members can come to understand. And so in that way, you look to that, the picture on the screen there is the community shaken by this officer-involved shooting and the protests that ripped through the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. The community came to Levine Museum and said, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond? How do we reconcile our history in this moment? How do we lean on the progressive ideas that defined our city in this moment of disruption? And so Levine Museum did the courageous thing and responded. And it did so in a variety of ways. There was the use of digital platforms, right? Twitter chats, tweet chats. We also convened a town hall. The image that you see on your screen is the convening. And I remember planning this convening and thinking to myself, people are so scared that they don't want to come together. This is such a polarized moment. Individuals will be scared to be in the same room. But what I learned is that there was a hunger and eagerness to come together as a community, and that the museum was the galvanizing space for those very difficult conversations that needed to take place in a place like Charlotte, that needed to take place in a place like Baltimore, that needed to take place in so many cities around the US and throughout the world. We also hosted a museum open house with curated tours talking about the long history of race and race relations, and even the challenges that existed between community members and law enforcement. Our goal wasn't to demonize anyone. It really was to provide a fuller picture, to provide a history, to ground the present in the historical narrative and in the data and in the documentation that was at our availability. And from there, launched No Justice, No Peace. Note, no is spelled K-N-O-W rather than N-O. And it really was sort of a way to sort of turn this idea, this sort of chant on its head and really rely on the ethos of museums as places that help people come to understand, as places that leverage history, as places that uses artifacts and objects to help community members and visitors understand the story of a place like Charlotte, the Carolina Piedmont, and the nation. So courageous inquiry looked something like this, making a rapid response exhibition. Now, for those that are practitioners, you know that it takes a long time to often develop exhibitions. It often, particularly when you're doing it in partnership with other entities, it takes even longer because you're outsourcing, you're also trying to build thoughtful relationships with those partners, and it takes a lot of strategizing. But we did this exhibition that would have inherently typically taken roughly 2 years. We did it in 3 months. 3 months. No Justice, No Peace, the work at Levine Museum of the New South has since been heralded as, in some ways, in the vanguard of this notion of a rapid response. And we did so not simply as the sole authority, we did it in partnership with community. And so part of the strategy, part of building capacity, part of being courageous was sharing the authority of creating the exhibition, of telling this story in collaboration with community members. We convened targeted dialogue. We made sure that we developed multi and intergenerational public programming. As the curator of this exhibition, I remember spending, 21-hour days, and that is not hyperbole, and that is not an exaggeration, 21-hour days, almost living with this exhibition, and really wanting to make sure that in this moment of polarization, of social and political polarization, that the museum could be a site of community, a site of dialogue, a site where people felt courageous enough to come together and talk about the hardest topics possible: race, socioeconomic challenges, police-involved shootings, and the challenges between civilian and law enforcement. And so we did that through the No Justice, No Peace exhibition. We also partnered with individuals like Alvin C. Jacobs, who calls himself an image activist, who really uses his camera to capture the raw emotions of communities and the nation during this incredible period of unrest. He traveled to almost every major city, capturing the breach of trust, capturing the raw emotions in places like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and many other places that had also been the site of unrest. We also partnered with some typical and traditional community partners. Professor of public history, Dr. Tiffany Packer, was actually teaching a course on the ways in which communities how museums can partner with community to be more courageous in the ways in which they tell their stories. Another thing that we did, which is totally outside of the box, and by courageous, I also mean being very creative. We did a call for contributions, which is not something typically museums have, almost a stockpile, if you will, a backlog of materials to populate their exhibitions. But when you're dealing with contemporary issues, it calls for more creative strategies for helping to tell those stories. And so one of the things that we thought was really important is that it wasn't the museum's job to be the authority, that the real authority on this story was the community. And so by doing this call for contributions, we asked artists, we asked police officers, we asked business owners, we asked protesters, we asked a cornucopia of individuals to help tell this story, to actually donate ephemera, to donate materials, photos, we crowdsourced images from those that were participating in the protests. There were a number of artists. Some of the buildings were actually vandalized. The artists got together to create sort of screens for the windows that were vandalized and use that art as a way to mobilize dialogue. We invited other artists, visual artists, to add to participate in the call for contributions. And most importantly, we asked people to tell their stories. So the call was for both materials, but it also was about storytelling and telling that story from a much more nuanced perspective. And these were some of the things that we collected. So we had first responders, for instance, who donated their backpacks, and we were able to display what does it mean to be boots on the ground during a protest. We also asked them for their dispatches. What did it mean? Not only what materials were you carrying, but what was your experience like? And one of the first responders responded in this sort of compelling way. I like to share what it's a beautiful and heartbreaking message. She said, "The injury that stuck with me the most was to a girl of 16 who was hit with a tear gas canister. She was completely silent up until the moment she told me, quote, 'The police are supposed to protect you, and I'm pretty sure they would have been fine killing us. Is this what Black people go through every day?' End quote." So these were the sort of raw stories we were collecting. And it was such a diverse perspective. Again, we weren't just sort of wanting to hear the protesters or wanting to hear first responders. We talked to angry business owners. We talked to faith-based leaders. We talked to police officers and other law enforcement agencies that were involved during the protests. We collected, this shirt here actually was still active with tear gas when we procured it. It was an attorney who was being boots on the ground offering support to protesters that were being obviously arrested during the protests. And so this is what it means to be courageous, right? To be creative and courageous enough to take on issues. You know, so often, at least in history museums, we rest on the laurels of historical distance. We have 15 years and lots of scholarship to help support interpretation. Try being in the thick of political protests and within 3 months, providing interpretation and contextualizing the moment. It is one of the most difficult things I've ever done as a museum practitioner, but I did it in part because I knew the benefit to the community. I knew that it would be an opportunity to create, to mend fences, to curate civil dialogue about really, really difficult topics, but most of all, to engender safety in this incredible moment of unrest and uncertainty. We also did what I like to call democratizing content development and delivery. And if you know anything about curators and about museums, we are incredibly careful about the content that we deliver. And we like to take a lot of ownership. We like to apply our expertise. And this was a moment where we had to have some shared authority. We had to democratize the content development. And the way that we did that was through community listening sessions. We convened intimate dialogues with community and museum stakeholders. And one of the things that we piloted was a pre-opening exhibit community editing forum. So we actually developed the core content And then we allow community to come in. You'll see to the right there, we allow community to come in and sort of say that actually doesn't capture the moment, or that's not correct. And it was a moment where we had to sort of humble ourselves as scholars, as museum practitioners, and really be open to the knowledge and really the expertise that communities had about this particular topic. When we talk about courageous inquiry, when we talk about democratizing content development and delivery, we are also talking about building trust. And so when we talk about museums as these extensions of the colonial complex, these are moments where we're really chipping away at that idea because we're inviting members of the community, many of whom are either, one would consider to be sort of armchair historians and certainly not lettered in a particular way, but they do bring knowledge and an understanding of the community, of their neighborhood history, of their own stories that we deemed valuable for the purposes of this exhibition. Now, we didn't just let community members tell the story. It remained mission aligned, right? So while we brought voices of community members and their perspective into the exhibition, we always went back to the history. So much of this interpretation wasn't just about sort of, our goal was to understand this moment, not in a vacuum, but as part of a larger historical narrative. And part of the thing that I developed was this Swan to Scott timeline, which really traced the cumbersome race relations in the Southeast and certainly in the nation. Swan refers to the Swan v. Board of Education, the Swan busing case, which was rooted in the Brown v. Board of Education decision. If you know about Brown, it was the landmark decision that sought to desegregate the US public schools. But the sort of problem with Brown is that there were no mechanisms for desegregating schools. The mechanism in a place like Charlotte was busing. And that happened more than 20 years after the Brown decision. Brown took place in roughly 1954, and Swan was in 1970. And so it took roughly 20 plus years to develop a mechanism for desegregating public schools. So we started with that narrative, and Scott refers to Keith Lamont Scott. So we really grounded this contemporary story within the larger historical narrative. We also looked at social context and mapping disparities, right? Again, none of this happens in a vacuum. We wanted to make sure that we provided a bit of context around racial segregation, around testing proficiencies, around the segregation of neighborhoods, and around the ways in which community members experienced the social context in different ways. There are parts of any community, not just Charlotte, who are the haves, and then there are the have-nots. And we wanted to make sure that our community was able to use data and context to help really map and understand the contemporary and the historical conundrum. We also, probably the most compelling part of this experience was an audiovisual protest tunnel. And it probably looks really simple, but it was quite nuanced. When we did that sort of audience testing, that pre-opening testing that I told you about, where we allowed community members to come in and edit, we learned something really important. So this audiovisual protest tunnel, you could actually hear the footage of the unrest alongside these images. And you also had media imagery that was sort of in conversation with this particular protest tunnel. And I had a protester come up to me and said, "This is triggering. This is triggering. I'm not sure that I can actually continue with this experience. Had we not heard that feedback, who knows how many individuals would have entered this experience, triggered, maybe even traumatized. So that sort of pre-test, that sort of democratization of the content development was an opportunity to make sure that we were also, creating a visitor experience that wasn't duplicating trauma in a moment that was already quite tender. And so we were able to mitigate that by putting signage and notice before coming into this phase of the gallery so that people could self-select, understanding that this part of the museum experience may be triggering for some. And so that was a really important lesson for me as a museum practitioner, and to really sit at the feet and to hear community members and the ways in which they experience this particular exhibition. We also created space for personal reflection. And finally, we created a suite of public programs. And sort of back to one of the earlier comments about museums being these places, these sites for catalytic conversations. This is one of the things that I feel most proud of, is bringing people together across difference. And you can see the diversity in these images. It was intergenerational, it was socioeconomically diverse, and certainly racially diverse. And this Breaking Bread series was a series of 3 conversations mobilized around 3 tough topics. We talked about stuff like race and officer involved shootings, both locally and nationally. We talked about social capital. We talked about activism and a whole host of other issues that were relevant to the Charlotte community and the larger national discourse. But what was really interesting, one of the things that we did was when we took reservations, we actually captured these zip codes. Zip codes in the context of a place like Charlotte tell you so much. It tells you if someone lives in South Charlotte, which is a really wealthy part of the city, or if they lived in North Charlotte, or West Charlotte, which was a much more, I would say, urban part of the Charlotte community. We took those zip codes and we used those to seat the guests. The goal was to make sure people were talking across their silos, that someone from South Charlotte would be in conversation with someone from West Charlotte, that the single mother from North Charlotte was in conversation with the banking executive. It was our goal to make sure that, again, not only are we being courageous and facilitating conversations and convening this really provocative exhibition during this tender moment for the city, but we were creating opportunities for talking across difference, right? For understanding the unique contours of our community and doing so together. And so I felt very proud. We actually sold out. And as an executive director, you always want not only your programming to be impactful, you also wanted to, to really add value to your bottom line. And this was a moment when we were able to actually generate new streams of income, but also make a real impact on the conversation in that community. And like many museums, we activated scholars, folks like Carol Anderson, who wrote the national bestseller White Rage, Wesley Laurie, who is a noted journalist. And we did talkback series to invite scholars to have conversations with community. It was such a powerful way to bring sort of the intellectual and the scholarly in conversation with the really common knowledge that community members brought to this experience. And then, of course, we activated a number of mobile concert series that also included dialogic dimensions. We traveled to churches to high schools, to auditoriums, to community spaces, libraries, and convened concerts. And these concerts were actually multi-genre. So we had jazz as well as the local symphony coming together, again, to model this sort of cross-difference conversation, to model courageous engagement, and again, to bring community together at a moment of uncertainty. And this is what, when I talk about courageous inquiry, I'm also thinking about how museums can be museums without walls, right? That you mobilize your cultural assets, your expertise, you're meeting community where they are, and not just sort of resting on the laurels of community coming to you. And so this was an opportunity for the museum to really take, if you will, its expertise and its creativity on the road to community centers throughout the city of Charlotte. And I am going to sort of stop there and invite conversation. In your opinion, you know, what is courageous inquiry? Is it a viable sort of concept for museums to leverage in the 21st century? And are you compelled by this idea of courageous inquiry? How might you apply that to your own work as practitioners, as scholars, and ultimately as community members where you are?
Thank you so much, Brenda, for this wonderful presentation, also very inspiring.